I used to work at a 7-Eleven here in the United States, and the scariest thing that ever happened to me there was also the single most terrifying thing that's ever happened in my entire life. It happened on a particularly quiet night. I was still kind of hungover from going out drinking the night before, and because of that, I wasn't even really paying attention when this one guy entered the store. I heard the door sliding open. I vaguely heard his footsteps as he walked up to the counter, and then, right as I was about to lift my head up and ask the man what he wanted, he slammed something down on the counter in front of me. I remember the very first thing I noticed being the sudden red splatter on my t-shirt, which was plain white. The moment his hand impacted the counter, all these little red specks appeared on my shirt. I already recoiled from the shock of having his hand slammed down in front of me, but when I saw what he'd just slammed down next to the register, I recoiled even further. It was a tongue, like an actual tongue. Even though it was soaked in blood, I could recognize the deep ridge running down the middle of it. It sounds like such a cliche when I think about it now, but now I understand what people mean when they say they were frozen in fear. The whole thing was an assault on my senses. I think it just short-circuited my fight-or-flight mechanism to the point where I couldn't figure out what to do. The look in the guy's eyes as he stared at me was so calm but intense. His eyes were so wide and unblinking, it was like he didn't have eyelids at all. It was only when he spoke that I actually found the will to move. All he said to me was, "Call 911. I bolted into the back office, locked the door behind me, and immediately called the cops. All the while, I watched the guy on the cameras, just standing there at the register. He didn't move at all. He seemed to be looking down, staring at the mess he'd just left on my counter. Given the gruesome nature of my emergency, there was a police patrol car and 2 cops pulling up outside in just a matter of moments. The guy didn't put up any kind of fight when they moved to arrest him. He just held his wrists and allowed them to put the handcuffs on him, then let the cops take him away. Once he was safely out of the store, I walked out of the office, trying not to look at what was still on the counter. Then I told the cops everything that happened. Obviously, it wasn't all that much, but as I was talking to them, I noticed more and more police surrounding a car in the parking lot that still had the door open. I called the store manager for the McDonald's across the street, telling them the cops had to close the store because it was an active crime scene. They rushed down to see me and find out what was going on, even though it was their day off. After telling them what happened, I went home to decompress. From what I heard after, the guy had gotten into an argument with his wife while driving somewhere. At some point, he just kinda snapped, pulled up into a parking lot, stabbed her to death, and then cut her tongue out. For some reason, he picked our 7-Eleven to walk into to slam the tongue he just cut out of her mouth down onto our countertop. As you might imagine, I was allowed to take a little bit of time off of work after that whole thing, as I just couldn't face going back there so soon. Even when I did go back, I was on edge the whole time for my first couple of shifts. I just couldn't seem to shake the image of that bloody tongue lying on the countertop in front of me. The thing I can't seem to shake either is that it wasn't enough for the guy to just stab and kill his own wife. He had to reach into her mouth afterwards and cut out her tongue. How completely insane with fury does someone have to be to do something like that? Like, what could possibly possess someone to do something so horrifying to someone they love? The guy didn't look like a monster either. He didn't look evil or deranged. All that gave away his distressed mental state was that crazy look in his eyes, the one that had frozen me in fear. It just haunts me, seeing seemingly normal people are capable of things like that. I used to work at a 7-Eleven that was right next to an art school campus. In addition to all the snacks and drinks, we had a little stationery section and kept some stuff behind the counter too. One of the things we kept behind the counter were scissors, the kind that are sealed in a plastic casing. So one day, this customer walks up to the counter with a Gatorade, and asks if he can have a pair of scissors too. Of course, I grabbed a pair for him. I scanned them and told him the price of both of his items. Instead of getting his wallet out though, he immediately started removing the plastic packaging from the scissors. I didn't think it too suspicious at first. I figured he needed them for some kind of minor emergency or something, and that he'd pay for them after cutting whatever it was that needed to be cut. Instead, once they were out of the packaging, he gripped the handle like they were a knife or something and looked me right in the eyes. "I could just kill you with these right now, you know that?" I was so stunned I didn't know what to say. I know he must have enjoyed the fearful look on my face because of the way he started smiling. All I could do was reach for my phone in my pocket and start to dial 911. I had no real way of defending myself, and I was hoping the cops would arrive before he actually killed me. Just as I tapped the numbers out, I looked up to see him walking away from the counter, laughing to himself as he walked out of the store. I stayed on the line with 911 for a while, shaking as I told them what just happened. When the cops showed up a little while later, and they took their time since it wasn't an ongoing situation, an officer reviewed the security camera footage. It turns out the guy had been doing the same thing all over town, picking out girls working retail on their own before shoplifting random items like that. He had the same MMO every single time too. He would always get away with it by telling the girl he could kill them with whatever he was stealing. Be it a knife or scissors or hedge clippers. He never actually hurt someone yet, but the cops were extra focused on getting him in cuffs because it felt like it was only a matter of time before he actually crossed the line and did hurt someone. Even though he took his time to show up, the cop was really helpful and reassuring. He gave me his cell number to call him directly the next time the man walked into the store. It must have been pretty serious because the guy actually had a real detective assigned to his case. Although I didn't hear about it afterwards, I sincerely hope the guy never crossed that line and actually hurt a girl with any of the items he ended up stealing. More than a decade ago, on one of the hottest days of the year, I was taking my kids down to the 7-Eleven near our apartment block to grab some big gulps. Just as we were walking past a public park right near a tree line, this completely normal, well-dressed looking couple emerged from the trees and started walking right towards us. I actually couldn't believe it when the guy suddenly told him to give him my wallet and anything else in my pockets. I really thought it was like a dumb joke of some kind. They looked so well-dressed they should have been in the office working or something. I actually let out this nervous laughter, then asked if they were serious. The guy answered my question by pulling out what looked like a fishing knife from his jacket pocket. When he opened it and pointed it at me, I shoved my daughter behind me to protect her as best I could. Then, just as I was going to do the same for my son, the woman grabbed his other arm and began pulling him towards her. I honestly felt like my heart was about to explode with fear. There's no other way of describing it. I suddenly just lost all sense of self-preservation as I leapt forward to attack this well-to-do looking woman who just grabbed my boy. The next thing I knew, I felt what I could only describe as a cold punch under the ribs of my left side. I looked down to see the guy had buried his fishing knife in my stomach. What came next felt like a little bit of divine intervention, honestly. 2 joggers had spotted what was going on and came over to intervene. This scared off at least one of the unassuming muggers. As I turned to check on my kids though, I felt my legs fall out from underneath me and I hit the ground hard. I remember hearing someone screaming and thinking it was my daughter. When I looked, the woman who had grabbed my son was on the ground though, crying and wailing with blood pouring from her mouth. Honestly, I didn't remember hitting her, but she seemed pretty adamant that I did. She was actually trying to make it out like she was the victim of the whole situation. Maybe trying to avoid getting arrested when the cops finally showed up. The police that patrolled that park showed up not long after. The cops actually started asking the woman what happened, like if we were a couple or something. My kids had to tell them that she was the partner of the guy that had stabbed me. This definitely threw the joggers off too, because they must have assumed that was the case as well. The whole time, I just kept begging someone to call the ambulance. I was pretty sure I was bleeding to death. I got taken to the hospital, and to my complete disbelief, I was questioned about the whole thing as though I was a suspect. I had no idea what this was about until a while after. It looked more and more likely I was going to be charged with battery for the woman, since it turned out she was actually from a decently well-off family and gotten into some vicious cycle of addiction with some trust fund junkie she'd met in the city. Her family actually tried to sue me when the charges didn't stick, but it was thrown out and she was sentenced for attempted kidnapping not long after. As for me, I had a tube in my chest for 2 weeks after surgery to remove the knife, but thankfully I made a full recovery. Honestly, when I look back on it, I'm just glad my kids didn't get hurt in any way, and I still run through all the horrific scenarios in my head where we didn't walk away from that situation relatively unscathed. I work at a 7-Eleven part-time in between classes. Earlier this year, we got a little rush of customers in the early afternoon one time. I served 2 guys for coffee and smokes, and at the back of the line, there was this tiny kid, no older than maybe 11 or 12, just waiting there patiently with a backpack in his hand. Honestly, I thought they looked kind of cute, like a little gentleman doing some grocery shopping for his mom or something. When he got to the front of the line, I asked him, "What can I help you with, sir?" in a kind of joking, playful way. Without a hint of emotion on his face, he reached into his backpack and suddenly pulled out a gun. "Give me all the money." When he pointed it at me, I wasn't sure if it was real or not. Where the hell would a 12-year-old kid get their hands on a loaded gun like that? It's not like the 7-Eleven I work at is in a high-crime area either. It's actually located in a pretty nice place, and although I've heard 1 or 2 stories from coworkers about some trouble at the store, nothing had ever happened like this. There was one other guy in the store at the time. I looked over at him to see him kind of smiling at the kid, smiling and frowning, like he was amused but disapproved of this kid playing a dumb childish prank. I don't know about guns, but I figured this guy must have, so I tried calling the kid's bluff. "You shouldn't point toys like that, sweetheart. Cops might think it's real or something." The kid then responded by cocking the gun. There was a real metallic sound that sent a shock of fear running through me. I knew no toy guns made that kind of sound. As if to illustrate he wasn't joking around, the kid pointed the gun in the air and fired a shot that went right past my head. After my ears got done ringing and I came to, I heard once again, "Give me all the money," in the same monotone, emotionless way. I didn't hesitate in doing what he asked. I put as much cash as I could onto the countertop, then watched him fill his backpack with it before he walked out of the store. I think the thing that scared me so much about this, though, was that the kid didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. He definitely seemed like he had something missing about him, like he didn't understand he could have actually killed someone over whatever dumb thing he wanted to buy with that money, be it video games or candy or whatever it was. At least a grown-up armed robber understands a gun is a means of getting what they want, and it's not a good idea to just fire it whenever, just in case they accidentally shoot someone in the face at the very least. I get the feeling though that if I'd even tried to resist or tell the kid no at all, he'd just shoot me in the face because it's what he assumed he should do. It's almost surreal to me now. The closest I'd ever come to death is at the hands of a small child, someone who should have been so innocent and carefree and full of love, but instead felt nothing. I had a guy come into the 7-Eleven I was working at, and when I was ringing up the items he wanted, he started getting all fresh with me, saying stuff like, "You're real pretty," and "What time do you finish work?" I lied to him and told him I was on till 11, even though I was finishing at 6, which was only about an hour away. He said he'd come back then, and we could go out for a beer or something. I advised him not to, since my boyfriend would be coming to pick me up around then, and he wouldn't like the idea of some random guy hitting on me. That didn't seem to bother this man too much though, as he made some dumb comment about how he'd make my boyfriend see things his way or something. I just nodded and ignored him. I could see him getting kind of angry before he walked out of the store. It didn't bother me too much though, as he was only going to come back to the store later to find out I wasn't even there. By that time, I'd be safe at home and away from this creepy pervert. At 6, when my shift finished, I walked outside with my purse, only to see a car door open about 20 or 30 feet away. I swear, I felt my stomach tie into knots when I saw that same man step outside. I did a straight 180-degree turn on my heels and started walking back into the store. I went right behind the counter, into the manager's office, after telling my coworker, "Just say I'm on break, okay?" He seemed real confused for a second, but as I shut the door and listened right at the edge of it, it was only 30 or so seconds at the most before I heard him say, "Oh, her? She's just on break. I'm sure she'll be on in a minute." Normally, I'd take the bus home, but that night I knew I'd have to get an Uber if I wanted to make it home at all without being seriously harmed. I called the Uber and waited for it to arrive. Then I tried to rush out as fast as I could. I didn't see the guy in the store anymore. I asked my coworker real quick as I was leaving, "Is that guy waiting for me?" He shook his head, still confused but now getting the gist of what was actually happening. They asked if I wanted them to call the cops, and shook my head, just gunning for my Uber. As I pushed open the glass door, I couldn't see the guy anywhere in the lot. I was so set on getting outside that I didn't look left or right as I walked out of the 7-Eleven. I had no warning because of this when the guy grabbed my arm from behind and jerked me backward. He looked really, really angry, and he growled at me. "You lied to me." He then called me a bunch of names as I tried pulling away from him. Luckily, my Uber driver saw absolutely everything. He jumped out of his car. "Hey, let her go right now or I'll call the cops." He did let me go. He smiled at the Uber driver as he told me, "This isn't over. I don't like being lied to." I wish that was just bluster, like he was trying to act hard to save a little face, but it was not. For the next 3 months, he made my life a living hell. He kept on waiting outside of the 7-Eleven to the point where I had to blow a ton of my wages on Ubers to and from work. Then there was the time he actually tried to follow me home. I had to tell the Uber driver what was happening so he could drive into the city just to shake the guy's tail. I tipped that guy massively, even though he initially refused to even accept payment for the ride. He insisted on canceling until I burst into tears and begged him to take the money and my tip. I couldn't make this someone else's problem. I couldn't have that on my mind, as well as all this other stuff. I actually developed something of a relationship with that one specific Uber driver. He became like a father figure to me, who always accepted my ride requests whenever he was working, and made sure no one tried to follow me home. He was also the guy that told me I needed to get the cops involved. He thought this guy was really going to hurt me. He knew people with the same mentality, and they only ever gave up when the law got involved. I didn't even know why I was surprised when I found out the guy had a previous conviction for stalking. He seemed to know the legal process like the back of his hand. He knew the process of getting a restraining order through the courts could take weeks at minimum. He'd come visit me at the 7-Eleven just to taunt me sometimes, and only leave once I threatened to call the cops on him. That was just about the only thing that really seemed to get to him too. The fact that he'd been arrested and convicted over something like that before. I wanted to tell him that he was pathetic, that he'd never have a good normal woman all to himself. He'd always be some kind of deranged psycho who got off on terrorizing those who couldn't defend themselves. But I didn't. In fact, I was told by one of the cops I spoke to not to antagonize him under any circumstances. "We don't know how far he'll push this if you make him angry. If it's possible, don't engage with him whatsoever." Like I said, that was my life for a whole 3 months. until the day finally came when my mom got the call from our family's attorney saying a judge had finally approved the restraining order. For those wondering, it took so long because this guy had no history of actual violence, and the whole grabbing incident wasn't classed as an assault for whatever reason. The day it finally came, though, he must have gotten some kind of notification because he just stopped showing up altogether. Seeing him waiting outside whenever I finished was such a regular occurrence that when he finally didn't show up, I actually cried with relief. I told Carl, the Uber driver, that I thought I was finally free. We had a kind of celebration on that final drive back to my house. He still picks me up from time to time too, when I've been out drinking with my friends or for whatever. It's awesome to be reunited with him after such a sickening ordeal. I suppose half the reason I'm sharing this is to help other girls avoid going through the same thing I did. Don't hesitate to get the cops involved with something like a stalking issue. There are literally laws in place to help deal with things like that. But the big thing is don't ever show a soft side or seem like you're playing hard to get. If a guy shows you any unwanted attention, make it clear you'll just call the cops right away. Heck, carry a stun gun or pepper spray if you're legally able to, just to show that son of a bitch you're carrying so they leave you alone. I just don't want anyone else to go through what I went through, because honestly, I lost 4 months of my life to this guy's abuse.